Forget everything you know about relaxing because your ancestors were absolute maniacs who thought the best way to nap was shoving radioactive uranium sandbags under their pillows to irradiate their brains. I have compiled 111 truly deranged ways history tried to cure insomnia, from eating literal poison to drilling holes in the skull for better airflow. Smash that subscribe button right now before the brain fog takes over, or I will tell everyone you still sleep with a nightlight. Let's get weird. 1. Getting a good night of sleep usually involves a soft pillow, not a sharp metal spike hammered into your face. Dr. Walter Freeman traveled across America in his lobotomobile, convincing exhausted families that the cure for insomnia was simple brain damage. He would take a literal ice pick from his kitchen drawer and drive it through the patient's eye socket directly into the frontal lobe. He wiggled it around to sever neural connections, which supposedly calmed the overactive mind but actually turned people into walking zombies. It stopped the insomnia because the patient no longer had enough personality left to care about being awake or anything else. 2. City living in the 1930s meant cramped apartments, so parents found a terrifying solution for nap time involving zero safety gear. Instead of just opening a window, they suspended a wire cage outside high-rise buildings and put their actual babies in it. These metal contraptions hung hundreds of feet above the concrete, allowing infants to sleep in the freezing cold air to toughen up their immune systems. Doctors actually recommended this insanity, claiming the fresh smog was vital for health while neglecting the massive risk of the cage snapping. Terrified neighbors watched babies shivering over the deadly drop until safety laws finally banned this absolute nightmare. 3. You might check labels for sugar today, but in the early 1900s, parents trusted a massive pharmaceutical company named Bayer to cure their crying children. Before 1924, this trusted brand sold literal heroin as a non-addictive cough syrup specifically marketed for toddlers and infants. Exhausted mothers spoon-fed this hard narcotic to their babies to knock them out for a peaceful night of sleep. The marketing campaigns showed happy kids while failing to mention the crushing addiction and severe respiratory failure that followed. It created an entire generation of toddler addicts who needed their fix just to stop screaming before the government finally banned the bottle. 4. If you think modern diet culture is toxic, just wait until you hear about the Victorian solution for women who could not sleep due to excess energy. Doctors sold pills containing live beef tapeworm cysts to ladies who wanted to slim down and sleep better by letting a parasite eat their food. Once swallowed, the worm hatched inside the stomach and grew up to 30 feet long while consuming the host's nutrients. The women certainly lost weight, but they also suffered from malnutrition and severe brain fog caused by the parasite stealing every vitamin. Getting the worm out was even worse, often involving choking it out with a metal cylinder. 5. Wealthy insomniacs in the Roaring '20s were obsessed with a new miracle drink called Radithor, which was actually just radioactive water in a fancy bottle. The marketing claimed that drinking nuclear waste would recharge the endocrine system and provide a deep restorative sleep for the tired elite. A famous industrialist named Eben Byers drank nearly 1,400 bottles, believing it was the ultimate health hack for his chronic fatigue. The radiation slowly disintegrated his jawbone until it literally fell off his face and filled his skull with holes. He was buried in a lead-lined coffin because his bones were still glowing, with radiation decades after his painful death. 6. We usually associate nicotine with a morning buzz, but 18th century doctors had a much more invasive method for reviving the drowsy. Physicians believed that blowing tobacco smoke up a patient's rectum was a brilliant medical procedure to balance humors and stimulate life. They used a bellows kit designed to pump thick fumes directly into the colon, which absorbs chemicals faster than the lungs. Instead of a refreshing wake-up call, patients often suffered massive nicotine overdoses that triggered violent seizures and instant collapse. It is the most ridiculous definition of blowing smoke ever recorded in medical history, and it frequently killed the patient on the spot. 7. Victorian women who felt tired or anxious were often prescribed a terrifying treatment called the rest cure, which was basically psychological torture disguised as medicine. Doctors forced these women to stay in bed for months at a time and strictly forbade them from reading, writing, or even thinking. The goal was to build up fatty tissue and blood, but the total sensory deprivation caused severe hallucinations and psychotic breaks. The famous author Charlotte Perkins Gilman was subjected to this misery, and it nearly drove her insane, leading her to write the yellow wallpaper. It turns out staring at a wall for 12 weeks does not actually cure depression. 8. Teenage boys in the 19th century lived in constant fear of a device designed to stop them from touching themselves at night. Doctors believed that self-pollution caused insomnia and insanity, so they locked boys into rigid steel corsets before bed. These metal cages were heavy and painful, forcing the sleeper to lie flat on their back without moving an inch all night long. The sheer anxiety of wearing a jagged metal trap prevented any actual rest and caused severe sleep deprivation. It was a brutal physical punishment for a natural biological function, and it likely created more psychological trauma than it ever prevented. 9. Abraham Lincoln is famous for saving the Union, but he was also slowly poisoning his own brain with a popular sleep medication called blue mass. These little pills were the standard 19th century cure for hypochondria and sleeplessness, but the main ingredient was liquid mercury. Lincoln took them for years to manage his melancholy, not realizing the heavy metal was causing his explosive rages and tremors. The mercury accumulated in his system, leading to paranoia and insomnia, which was the exact opposite of what he wanted. He eventually stopped taking them when he realized they made him feel crazy, but the damage to his nervous system was already done. 10. Exhausted Victorian parents did not have iPads to distract their kids, so they used a much deadlier tool to get some peace and quiet. When a child would not stop crying or refuse to sleep, the parents would soak a handkerchief in chloroform and place it over the baby's face. The chemical fumes would knock the child unconscious almost instantly, which looked like a deep sleep to the uneducated eye. The problem was that the margin between sedation and death was incredibly thin, and many children never woke up. So it caused fatal cardiac arrest and respiratory failure, turning a simple nap into a tragic funeral. 11. Victorian women were obsessed with looking pale and interesting, like a tragic novel character, so they turned to a deadly cosmetic hack. They bought arsenic complexion wafers to nibble on before bed, believing the poison would clear their skin and induce a beautiful sleep. The arsenic did make them pale because it was actively destroying their red blood cells and slowly shutting down their vital organs. Instead of beauty sleep, they got confusion and eventual brain damage as the heavy metal accumulated in their neural tissue. It was a slow suicide sold in a pretty box to ladies who just wanted to look their best while unconscious. 12. Thomas Edison hated sleep and thought it was a waste of time, so he invented a method to intentionally ruin it. He would sit in a chair with steel ball bearings in his hand and drift off for a tiny nap. As soon as his muscles relaxed, the heavy balls would crash onto the floor and startle him awake instantly. This prevented him from ever entering deep REM sleep, which is crucial for brain health and memory processing. He was basically torturing himself to stay productive, but it likely made him incredibly irritable and impossible to work with. It is a miracle he did not lose his mind completely. 13. Before the Industrial Revolution, humans naturally slept in two distinct shifts, with a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. Factory owners decided that this natural rhythm was losing them money, so they forced workers into one solid block of sleep. See, we are still suffering from this unnatural shift today, which is why you wake up at 3 in the morning feeling anxious. It was the first time in history that capitalism dictated biology and ruined our circadian rhythms forever. We trade our natural rest for productivity and end up with chronic exhaustion that even the strongest coffee cannot fix, no matter how much you drink. 14. Benjamin Franklin was a genius inventor, but his sleep routine was absolute madness, involving total nudity in front of his neighbors. He believed that fresh air was the key to health, so he sat stark naked in front of an open window for hours before bed. He called these his air baths, and did this even in the freezing cold, believing it toughened his skin. Now, neighbors were likely horrified to see a founding father shivering in the buff while reading by candlelight. Instead of better sleep, he mostly just froze himself awake and risked pneumonia for the sake of a very strange theory about skin breathing. 15. Doctors once believed that insomnia was caused by having too much blood or energy inside the body, so they drained it out. To fix this, they would slice open a vein and drain pints of blood from the patient until they passed out. The doctors called this a successful sedation, but in reality, the patient was entering hypovolemic shock from blood loss. It is terrifying to think that the cure for being wide awake was to be bled until your brain literally shut down from lack of oxygen. This barbaric practice killed more people than it ever helped and left survivors weak and dizzy for weeks. Aka 16. In the early 20th century, wealthy women paid a fortune for a procedure called twilight sleep during childbirth and stressful nights. Doctors injected them with scopolamine and morphine, which did not actually stop the pain or help them rest. It simply erased their memory of the event so they could not recall the screaming or the trauma the next morning. It was chemical amnesia that left patients in a zombie-like state where they could still feel pain but could not form memories. It was a terrifying loss of autonomy disguised as a medical miracle for the elite who wanted to forget their suffering. 17. Gullible men in the Victorian era bought mail-order electric belts to recharge their manly vigor while they slept. These questionable devices strapped around the waist and used acid batteries to send mild shocks into the skin all night. The ads promised to cure nervous exhaustion, but usually resulted in nasty chemical burns and skin lesions from leaking acid. It was the 19th century equivalent of sticking a fork in a toaster to get more energy. Instead of waking up, refreshed users woke up with welts and a burning sensation that definitely did not help them sleep or feel any more manly. 18. Dr. James Salisbury convinced thousands of people in the 1880s that vegetables were toxic and caused insomnia. His solution was a diet consisting entirely of boiled beef and hot water 3 times a day to cure all ailments. Patients ate nothing but meat for months, which led to severe vitamin C deficiency and scurvy. Their gums bled and their teeth fell out while their brains suffered from the lack of essential nutrients. It turns out that malnutrition makes it very hard to sleep, but the doctor insisted they just needed more beef to fix it. It was the original carnivorous diet disaster. 19. Before ether was used for surgery, people used it to throw wild parties called ether frolics to cure their boredom. Guests would inhale the volatile fumes from a rag to pass out and giggle uncontrollably before collapsing on the floor. It was cheaper than alcohol, but the fumes were incredibly flammable and destroyed brain cells instantly. Many people woke up with what they called ether pneumonia, or just died from respiratory failure during the fun. It was a dangerous game of chemical roulette that ruined lungs and fried neural pathways for a quick buzz that left them permanently foggy. 20. Charles Dickens was a literary genius who was absolutely obsessed with the Earth's magnetic fields to a debilitating degree. He believed he could not sleep unless his bed was aligned perfectly north to south to let the currents flow through him. He carried a compass everywhere he went and would rearrange hotel furniture just to satisfy this bizarre compulsion. If the bed was facing west, he would spend the entire night in a state of severe anxiety and panic. It was a placebo effect that ruled his life and made traveling with him a complete nightmare for everyone involved, including his very tired family. 21. A Buckminster Fuller was a genius architect who thought sleeping 8 hours was for losers, so he invented the Dymaxion cycle. He only slept for 30 minutes every 6 hours, which sounds like torture to anyone with a brain. For 2 years, he lived like this and claimed he felt amazing while working constantly around the clock. The only reason he stopped was because his exhausted colleagues could not keep up with his zombie schedule. It turns out having a boss who is awake 24 hours a day is a nightmare for everyone else. He eventually went back to normal sleep, but the legacy of his extreme napping remains. 22. If you had insomnia in the 19th century, doctors assumed your brain was just too hot and needed ventilation. To cool it down, they applied a paste made from crushed blister beetles directly onto your shaved scalp. These toxic bugs contained cantharidin, which is a chemical weapon that causes massive painful blisters on human skin. The theory was that the fluid weeping from your head was the madness leaving your body. Patients would scream in agony while their scalp literally melted off, which surprisingly did not help them sleep. It was torture disguised as medicine, and it usually resulted in permanent scarring and a lifelong fear of doctors. 23. Modern parents stress about screen time, but the baby boomer generation was literally raised on hard narcotics sold at the grocery store. Paregoric was a camphorated opium tincture found in almost every American medicine cabinet until 1970. When a baby was teething or just being fussy, exhausted mothers would rub this opium syrup on their gums. It worked instantly because the infant was high and sedated by a powerful depressant. Millions of children spent their early years in a drug-induced fog, which explains a lot about the 70s. It was eventually regulated, but for decades the secret to a quiet household was just casual opium. 24. Victorian etiquette experts were convinced that breathing through your mouth made you look stupid and ruined your facial structure. To fix this, they sold leather chin straps that strapped your jaw shut while you slept like a horse harness. The idea was to force nasal breathing, which supposedly improved intelligence and kept the demons out. The users would wake up with terrifying strap marks on their faces and a sore jaw from fighting the leather all night. It did nothing for their intelligence, but it did make them look like Hannibal Lecter while they napped. It is hilarious that people paid good money to be muzzled in bed. 25. You might drink a smoothie for health, but rural insomniacs used to head straight to the slaughterhouse for a warm beverage. They believed that drinking a mug of fresh blood immediately after the animal was killed would transfer vitality to them. This vampire-like habit was supposed to cure exhaustion, but mostly it just introduced dangerous bacteria to the gut. People would stand in line with cups waiting for the butcher to finish his job, which is a horror movie scene. Instead of feeling energized, they usually ended up with severe stomach infections. It is a miracle anyone survived this practice without turning into patient zero. 26. Before artificial sweeteners existed, people used a chemical called lead acetate to make their wine and nightcaps taste delicious. It was known as sugar of lead, and it was the perfect addition to a relaxing evening drink before bed. The only problem was that lead is a potent neurotoxin that accumulates in the brain and causes total insanity. This condition was called Saturnism, and it led to blindness and even worse insomnia than before. People were literally sweetening their way to madness while wondering why their nerves were shattered. It is tragic that the very thing they used to relax was slowly turning their brains into sludge. 27. Superstition used to be the main form of healthcare, so people hung heavy stones with natural holes over their beds. These were called hag stones, and they were supposed to prevent bad dreams and keep witches away at night. The logic was that the demons would get confused by the hole and leave the sleeper alone, which makes zero sense. The real danger was not a witch, but the heavy rock suspended by a weak string directly above your face. Gravity often did its job, and the stone would crash down on the sleeper, causing concussions. It is ironic that the charm against nightmares actually caused trauma. 28. Leonardo da Vinci was a genius artist who decided that sleep was an annoying interruption to his painting schedule. He adopted the Uberman cycle, where he slept for just 20 minutes every 4 hours around the clock. He claimed it gave him decades of extra time to work, but modern attempts to copy him usually end in disaster. People who try this today suffer from severe cognitive crashes and memory loss within a week. The human brain needs deep sleep to clean itself, and skipping it just makes you hallucinate. Leonardo might have been a mutant, but for everyone else, this schedule is a fast track to a breakdown. 29. If you could not sleep in the 19th century, some fringe doctors suggested that your skull was just too airtight. They performed a procedure called trepanation, which involved drilling a literal hole into the bone of your head without anesthesia. The theory was that fresh air would cool the brain and release the pressure that was keeping you awake. Patients sat there while a hand crank drill pierced their skull, which is the stuff of nightmares. Surprisingly, some people survived the infection risk, but they were left with a permanent soft spot. It proves that desperate people will agree to absolutely anything if they are tired enough. 30. The Industrial Revolution created a dark market for a cheap syrup known on the streets as Godfrey's cordial. It was a mix of opium and molasses sold to poor factory workers who needed their hungry children to sleep. It was so effective at silencing babies that it earned the terrifying nickname, the Burial Club, because so many infants never woke up. Parents were often too poor to afford food, so they used the syrup to suppress appetites and induce a coma. It was a tragedy of poverty where thousands of children were unknowingly overdosed by their own families. This bottle of poison is one of the darkest chapters in history. 31. In the early atomic age, people were obsessed with radiation and thought it was a magical cure for everything, including insomnia. Enter the uranium sand pad, which was exactly what it sounds like, a pouch filled with radioactive ore dust. Desperate sleepers would place this glowing bag of death directly under their pillows to irradiate their brains into a peaceful slumber. The marketing claimed the gentle rays would soothe the nerves, but in reality they were blasting their skulls with ionizing radiation all night long. It is a miracle anyone survived this phase without growing a second head or losing their hair overnight. 32. If you think essential oils are fake, just wait until you hear about the old folk remedy involving root vegetables. Insomniacs were told to slice up raw onions and stuff them into their socks before climbing into bed. The belief was that the pungent vegetable would draw out feverish thoughts and toxins through the soles of the feet. Instead of a restful night, the sleeper mostly just experienced severe skin irritation and a bedroom that smelled like a fast food dumpster. It kept everyone else in the house awake with the stench while the person with onion feet wondered why they were still single. 33. Victorian doctors had a very loose definition of medicine and frequently prescribed lethal poisons to help you relax. Strychnine is now used to kill rats, but back then it was sold in tiny doses as a nerve tonic for exhaustion. The idea was to stimulate the system just enough to reset it, but the margin for error was terrifyingly small. One extra drop of this bitter liquid could send the patient into full-body convulsions and painful muscle spasms. It is hard to get a good night of sleep when your back is arched like a bow and your jaw is locked shut forever. 34. Winter in the 19th century was brutally cold, so rural parents came up with a hygiene nightmare to keep kids warm. They would literally sew their children into heavy flannel underwear in November and not cut them out until spring arrived. This meant the child wore the same filthy wool suit for months without bathing, which ruined their skin and sleep quality. The itching alone must have been absolute torture as lice and sweat accumulated under the fabric layers. It is a miracle these kids did not die of sepsis or just go insane from the constant scratching while trying to rest. 35. Winston Churchill is a legendary leader, but his sleep habits were a chaotic mess that would kill a normal person. He treated his bed like an office and would stay there until noon dictating speeches to his staff while completely naked. He fueled this morning routine with weak whiskey and cigars while his poor secretaries tried to look anywhere else. He viewed sleep as a tool he could manipulate and took naps whenever he felt like it, regardless of the war. It takes a specific kind of confidence to run a country while wearing nothing but a cigar and a glass of scotch. 36. Some medical advice is just a misunderstanding, but this one is pure nastiness that somehow became a legitimate health trend. So doctors actually told insomniacs to drink a glass of their own morning urine to recycle vital energies for the next night. The theory was that your body lost magic nutrients while you slept, and drinking it back would close the loop. It is hard to imagine anything more disgusting than starting your day with a warm cup of your own waste. This placebo effect required a very strong stomach and likely caused more vomiting than actual restful sleep for the unfortunate patient. 37. Before we had safe sleeping pills, we had a chemical sledgehammer known as chloral hydrate, or the Mickey Fin. It was the first synthetic sedative ever made, and it knocked people out with terrifying efficiency. Bartenders used it to rob patrons, and doctors used it to silence patients, but the side effects were brutal. It caused severe heart arrhythmias and permanent liver damage while the person lay unconscious and unable to call for help. The line between a good night of sleep and never waking up again was measured in mere drops of this liquid nightmare. It was effective but deadly. 38. Men in the early 20th century were sold a gadget that promised to soothe them to sleep through a very invasive method. The prostate warmer was a metal probe that you plugged into a wall outlet and inserted into the rectum before bed. The heat was supposed to relax the pelvic muscles and cure insomnia, but it was basically a soldering iron for your insides. The risk of internal burns and electrocution was incredibly high for a device meant to help you nap. It is shocking that anyone thought plugging a rectal heater into the mains was a safe idea. 39. Diet culture went off the rails when doctors suggested that the very act of digesting food was keeping people awake. The starvation cure involved fasting for weeks at a time to let the stomach rest so the brain could finally shut down. Patients would stop eating entirely and waste away in their beds while their families watched them slowly starve to death. The hallucinations caused by extreme hunger were mistaken for deep spiritual rest rather than the brain shutting down. It turns out that being hangry is real and starving yourself is the worst possible way to cure insomnia. 40. If you had insomnia caused by syphilis in the Victorian era, the treatment was arguably worse than the disease itself. Doctors would put patients inside a wooden box with just their head sticking out and pump in vaporized mercury. The toxic fumes would coat the skin and be inhaled into the lungs to kill the bacteria and induce sleep. Instead of curing anything, it turned their gums black and made their teeth fall out while rotting their brains. The madness associated with mercury poisoning just made the insomnia worse until the patient finally died from the heavy metal toxicity. 41. Puritan parents in colonial America invented the most awkward sleepover in history called bundling to save firewood during winter courtship. They would tuck a teenage couple into the same bed with a heavy wooden board placed strictly between them to prevent any physical contact. The idea was to keep them warm without letting them touch, but it was a recipe for disaster. Instead of getting any rest, the couple lay there awake all night in a state of extreme sexual tension and anxiety. It turns out that sleeping inches away from your crush with a plank in your ribs is not relaxing. It ruined the sleep of an entire generation of horny adolescents. 42. Michelangelo was a genius artist who painted the Sistine Chapel, but his personal hygiene was absolutely disgusting, even for the Renaissance. He was so obsessed with his work that he would sleep in his clothes and boots for days at a time without changing. He treated his body like a machine and refused to waste time on trivial things like undressing or bathing before bed. When he finally decided to take his boots off after weeks of work, his skin reportedly peeled off right along with the leather. It is a horrifying image of dedication gone wrong. The man created masterpieces while his feet were literally rotting inside his shoes from pure neglect. 43. If you had a headache or insomnia in the 19th century, doctors assumed your brain was just too full of blood. To fix this congested state, they would attach live leeches directly to your temples and let them feast on your face. The theory was that draining the excess blood would cool the brain and induce a state of calm relaxation. Patients would sit there with slimy parasites hanging off their heads until they felt dizzy and lightheaded from the blood loss. It was not a cure for insomnia, it was just induced anemia that made you pass out. Waking up with leech bites on your forehead is definitely worse than staying awake. 44. On pharmacies in the Victorian era were basically drug dens selling a popular mixture called chlorodyne to anyone with a coin. This potent syrup was marketed as a cure, all for sleeplessness, but it was actually a lethal cocktail of cannabis chloroform and morphine. It combined 3 powerful depressants into one bottle, which is a guaranteed way to stop your breathing forever. People would take a spoonful to help them doze off and accidentally slip into a coma because the mixture was never consistent. It was the ultimate game of Russian roulette played with a medicine spoon. Selling this over the counter to tired parents is absolutely terrifying to think about today. 45. We have all struggled to keep our eyes open during a boring meeting, but history had a painful solution for that. Inventors created terrifying metal clips called eye springs that were designed to physically prop your eyelids open during the day. The logic was that by forcing your eyes to stay open, you would be so exhausted by nightfall that sleep would be instant. In reality, it just caused excruciating dry eye and corneal damage while making the user look like a clockwork monster. It is hard to sleep when your eyes are scratched and burning from having metal hooks in them all day. This invention rightfully belongs in the trash. 46 of modern parents give their kids warm milk, but in the 1800s, German families served a hearty bowl of beer soup for breakfast. This traditional recipe involved boiling beer with milk and flour to create a thick porridge for children to eat before school. The alcohol content was not always cooked off, so kids were starting their day with a mild buzz that stunned their developing brains. It certainly calmed them down, but it also likely stunted their growth and made learning math incredibly difficult. It is shocking to think that getting a child slightly drunk was considered a nutritious way to start the day. No wonder historical figures look so tired. 47. Before we had sophisticated sleeping pills, doctors relied on a salt called potassium bromide to sedate the mentally ill and the sleepless. It was the standard sedative for decades, but it came with a horrifying side effect known as bromism. The chemical would build up in the body and cause a zombie-like psychosis that made the patient look and act insane. Doctors would see the symptoms and just prescribe more bromide, which created a vicious cycle of poisoning. It turned normal people into drooling vegetables who could not speak or think clearly. The cure for your insomnia was basically to lose your mind completely until you were too confused to be awake. 48. If you look at old paintings of beds, You might notice they are incredibly short because people used to sleep sitting up. In the 19th century, there was a widespread fear that lying completely flat would cause blood to pool in the brain and cause a stroke. People would pile up 4 or 5 pillows to prop themselves into a seated position for the entire night to stay safe. This unnatural posture prevented them from entering deep REM sleep and caused chronic neck pain for millions of people. They were voluntarily depriving themselves of rest because they were terrified of a medical myth. It explains why everyone in the past was so cranky. 49. Hunter S. Thompson was a famous writer who lived on a schedule that would kill a horse, let alone a human. He slept from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, and then fueled his waking hours with cocaine and Chivas Regal. His daily routine was a chemical roller coaster that completely destroyed his circadian rhythm and turned his life into a blur. He used drugs to wake up and alcohol to eventually crash, which is the least sustainable lifestyle imaginable. It worked for his gonzo journalism style, but his heart and brain were paying a heavy price every single day. It is a miracle he functioned at all. 50. Hydrotherapy sounds relaxing like a spa day, but the wet pack treatment was actually a freezing nightmare for insomniacs. Doctors would take a patient who could not sleep and wrap them tightly in sheets soaked in ice-cold water. They were then covered with wool blankets to trap the cold against their skin for hours at a time. The shock of the freezing water was supposed to calm the nerves, but it actually induced hypothermic shock. The patient would stop moving because their body was shutting down to conserve heat, not because they were relaxed. It was torture disguised as a cure, and it left people shivering and traumatized for days. 51. In 1903, science finally gave us the first true sleeping pill called Veronal, which was hailed as a miracle. It was the first barbiturate, and it promised to knock you out cold without the messy side effects of opium. The problem was that Veronal had absolutely no ceiling effect, meaning that taking just slightly too much would simply stop your breathing. Famous people and housewives alike started dropping dead in their beds because the line between sleep and death was invisible. It was sold as a safe sedative, but in reality it was a chemical weapon that killed thousands of people who just wanted a nap. 52. Sleepwalking can be dangerous, but the cure invented in the early 20th century was arguably much worse for your ankles. Worried families bought lead-weighted shoes called slumber slippers to ground the sleeper and physically prevent them from wandering out of bed. The idea was that if your feet were too heavy to lift, you would just give up and go back to sleep. In practice, the poor sleepwalker would try to stand up and immediately crash to the floor, causing broken toes and twisted ankles. It turns out that strapping anchors to an unconscious person is a terrible safety strategy that causes more injuries than it prevents. 53. We have all heard that eating cheese before bed gives you nightmares, but for centuries people thought this was just a myth. It turns out that aged cheese is packed with a chemical called tyramine, which triggers the brain to release norepinephrine. This stimulant keeps your brain active while you sleep, resulting in incredibly vivid and terrifying hallucinations known as the cheese dream. People would snack on a nice sharp cheddar and then spend the entire night fighting demons in their own heads. It is hilarious that a simple late-night snack was accidentally fueling a global epidemic of bad dreams without anyone realizing why. 54. Before central heating became standard, families relied on coal stoves to keep their bedrooms warm during the long winter nights. The ventilation was often terrible, which meant that people were slowly filling their rooms with odorless carbon monoxide gas. They would drift off into a deep sleep, thinking the warmth was making them cozy when actually they were being poisoned. Families would wake up with dull, throbbing headaches and confusion, which they just assumed was part of life. It is terrifying to realize that for decades, a good night of sleep was often just mild asphyxiation that slowly killed brain cells while you dreamed. 55. If you wake up at 3 in the morning, do not panic because your body is just trying to follow an ancient rhythm. Before electricity, humans slept in 2 distinct shifts with a period of wakefulness in the middle, called the watch. People would use this time to smoke, pray, or visit neighbors before going back to sleep until dawn. The invention of the light bulb forced us to compress this into one block, which caused modern sleep anxiety. We basically broke our own biology for the sake of staying up late, and now we wonder why we cannot sleep through the night without waking up. 56. Nikola Tesla was a brilliant inventor who gave us alternating current, but his bedtime routine was absolutely bizarre. He believed that the key to recharging his brain was to curl his toes exactly 100 times for each foot. He claimed this repetitive motion stimulated his brain cells and prepared him for his short 2-hour naps. It sounds like a nervous tic, but he swore it was the secret to his genius and energy levels. Imagine the smartest man on Earth lying in the dark, frantically wiggling his toes while trying to invent the future. It is a wonder he ever got any rest at all. 57. 19th century doctors had a very literal approach to fixing a disorganized mind that could not sleep. They would strap the patient into a special spinning chair and rotate them at high speeds until they either vomited or passed out. The medical theory was that the centrifugal force would physically rearrange the brain matter and induce a calm state. In reality, it just caused extreme vertigo and nausea that made relaxing impossible for days. It is hard to sleep when your entire world is still spinning and you are covered in your own lunch. This therapy was pure torture disguised as a medical breakthrough. 58. In the 1970s, doctors prescribed a drug called Quaaludes as a safe alternative to barbiturates for helping people relax. Users quickly discovered that the drug caused such extreme loss of motor control that they turned into rubber. People would fall down flights of stairs or crash their cars without feeling a single thing until they woke up in a cast. It was marketed as a gentle sleep aid, but it turned an entire generation into stumbling zombies who broke bones constantly. The Wolf of Wall Street made it look funny, but the reality was thousands of overdoses and shattered limbs before it was banned. 59. Franz Mesmer convinced the world that an invisible force called animal magnetism flowed through every living thing. He would wave large magnets over sleeping patients to polarize their fluids and cure their insomnia without touching them. Crowds of people would gather to watch these sessions, believing they were witnessing a scientific miracle of energy healing. It was essentially a magic trick that delayed actual medical treatment for serious conditions while the patient waited for the magnets to work. And the placebo effect was strong, but it turns out that waving a metal bar over a sick person does absolutely nothing for their sleep. 60. Old wives' tales often suggested eating a massive heavy meal right before bed to help weigh you down. The idea was that drawing blood to the stomach for digestion would leave the brain empty and ready for sleep. In practice, eating a giant pot roast at midnight causes severe acid reflux and indigestion that keeps you awake in agony. Your body has to work overtime to digest the food, which raises your core temperature and ruins deep sleep. It is the culinary equivalent of punching yourself in the stomach to relax. And it explains why so many ancestors had chronic stomach issues. 61. Victorian folks wanted to glow with health, so they took pills made of white phosphorus, which is the stuff used in matches. The idea was to stimulate the brain and look radiant, but the side effects were straight out of a horror movie. It caused a condition called phossy jaw, where the actual jawbone would rot away inside the mouth and emit a greenish glow in the dark. Imagine trying to sleep while your own face is disintegrating and lighting up the pillow like a nightlight. It was a slow, painful death sold as a beauty hack and a sleep aid that literally ate you alive from the inside out. 62. If you lived in rural America and could not sleep, the local witch doctor had a very specific solution involving livestock. You had to cut off a lock of your own hair, stuff it inside a raw apple, and feed it to a neighbor's pig. The belief was that the pig would digest your insomnia, along with the fruit, leaving you free to rest peacefully. In reality, you just wasted a good apple and annoyed a pig that now had hair stuck in its teeth. It is hilarious to think people blamed their sleeplessness on transferable spirits, rather than just being uncomfortable or stressed out. 63. Honoré de Balzac was a famous French writer who treated his body like a chemistry experiment gone wrong to stay productive. He drank 50 cups of thick black coffee every single day to fuel his writing marathons, which is enough caffeine to kill a horse. He only slept in tiny crashes when his heart physically could not take any more stimulation and simply shut down. And he wrote amazing books, but he also died young because his heart muscles were completely destroyed by the constant stimulant abuse. It turns out that replacing sleep with espresso is not a sustainable life hack no matter how many deadlines you have. 64. Victorian doctors were terrified of women having any thoughts at all, especially if those thoughts were keeping them awake at night. If a woman had erotic dreams or insomnia, the medical solution was often to surgically remove her ovaries to cure the hysteria. This barbaric surgery threw young women into instant surgical menopause, which altered their hormones and brain chemistry forever. It was a permanent mutilation for a temporary problem based entirely on sexist pseudoscience about female biology. And the fact that this was considered standard medical care is a terrifying reminder of how dangerous it was to be a woman in the 19th century. 65. Medical science has given us some bad ideas, but Dover's powder was a masterclass in mixed signals for the human body. It was a popular sleeping powder that combined opium, which puts you to sleep, with ipecac, which makes you vomit violently. The idea was to sweat out the fever while you slept, but the dosage was incredibly tricky to get right. If you took just a little too much to help you doze off, you would wake up projecting vomit across the room. It is hard to get a restful night of sleep when your body is fighting a war between sedation and regurgitation. 66. Snoring has always been annoying, but the solution in the early 1900s was a torture device called the nasal dilator. These were metal springs that you shoved up your nose to force the nostrils open and improve airflow during the night. The metal was often cheap and would rust inside the damp environment of the nose, causing infections and pain. Even worse, the springs could dislodge and be inhaled directly into the lungs while the person was gasping for air. It turns out that putting rusty metal scrap up your nose is not the best way to get a good night of rest. 67. Lord Byron was the original celebrity influencer, and he convinced everyone that being pale and thin was the height of fashion. To achieve this look and sleep less, he drank massive amounts of vinegar and water to suppress his appetite. The acid destroyed his tooth enamel and burned holes in his stomach lining, which caused chronic pain and insomnia. His fans copied him and ruined their own health just to look like a starving poet who could not sleep. It is proof that dangerous diet fads are not a modern invention, they just used to involve a lot more acid and a lot less science. 68. Early photography was a magical new technology, but it required some incredibly dangerous chemicals to develop the images properly. Photographers often slept in their studios, which were poorly ventilated and filled with fumes from potassium cyanide used in the process. They would lie down for a quick nap and slowly inhale the toxic gas, which caused dizziness and eventually death. So it was called the sleep of death because they simply drifted away without ever waking up to check their prints. Art requires sacrifice, but dying from invisible poison gas just to develop a portrait seems like a very high price to pay for a hobby. 69. Before we understood germs, people believed that disease was spread by bad air or miasma that floated around at night. To protect themselves, families would nail their windows shut and stuff rags into every crack to keep the fresh air out. This created hot, stuffy rooms with zero oxygen circulation, which was the perfect breeding ground for tuberculosis and mold. Instead of staying healthy, they were trapping themselves in a bacterial incubator that made everyone sick and ruined their sleep quality. It is ironic that the fresh air they were so terrified of was actually the one thing that could have saved them from the infection. 70. The king of rock and roll had a sleep schedule that was more chemical than biological, and it eventually destroyed him. Elvis Presley lived on a strict regimen of uppers to wake up for performances and downers to knock him out afterwards. This chaotic cycle of stimulants and barbiturates confused his body so much that he could not function without a pill. His doctor prescribed thousands of doses, which led to chronic constipation and severe heart strain that stopped him cold. It is a tragic reminder that you cannot cheat your circadian rhythm forever without paying the ultimate price in the end. 71. If a patient in the late 19th century was too anxious or hysterical to eat, dinner doctors had a horrific solution. They believed that food could be absorbed from the other end, so they injected soup milk and beef tea directly into the rectum. This was called rectal feeding, and it was prescribed to insomniacs who were too weak to chew their own meals. Instead of gaining strength, patients usually developed massive bacterial infections and sepsis from putting food where it definitely does not belong. It is a medical procedure so backward that it sounds like a bad joke, but it killed President Garfield. 72. The most terrifying mascot in history was the smiling baby on the bottle of Cop's Baby's Friend. This popular medicine promised to soothe crying infants and help them sleep through the night with zero fuss. The secret ingredient was a heavy dose of morphine, which is a powerful opioid that suppresses the respiratory system. The baby was not sleeping peacefully, it was actually slipping into a coma and struggling to breathe while the parents smiled. It caused thousands of deaths that were written off as crib death before the government finally stepped in to ban the friendly poison from the shelves. 73. We all know that blood flow is important, but some inventors took it way too far with the gravity bed. This device tilted the sleeper so their head was significantly lower than their feet all night long. The theory was that gravity would pull more blood into the brain to nourish the cells and cure insomnia. In reality, it just caused massive intracranial pressure and swollen faces that looked like a tomato. It increased the risk of stroke significantly because the human brain is not designed to be pressurized like a soda can for 8 hours straight. 74. Herbal tea sounds like a gentle way to relax, but Victorian insomniacs were brewing straight poison in their kitchens. They used belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, to make a tea that would seduce the nerves into sleep. The plant contains atropine, which can stop your heart if the dosage is off by even a tiny amount. People would sip this lethal brew, hoping for a nap, and accidentally drift into the eternal sleep of death. It is shocking that the difference between a good night of rest and a funeral was just how long you steeped the leaves. 75. Housewives in the early 20th century loved a spotless home and used a chemical called benzene to clean everything. Nay, they would scrub the bedroom floors and linens with this powerful solvent right before going to sleep. Benzene is a massive carcinogen that releases sweet-smelling fumes that make you feel dizzy and drunk. The family would pass out quickly thinking the room was fresh, but they were actually being anesthetized by toxic gas. It caused leukemia and bone marrow failure, while everyone complimented the lady of the house on her cleaning skills. It was a sparkling clean death trap. 76. Central heating is a modern luxury, so rural families in winter had to get creative to avoid freezing to death. Their solution was to bring the farm animals inside the house and sleep huddled next to the pigs and cows. The body heat from a 1,000-pound animal is great, but the fleas and zoonotic diseases are not. Sharing a pillow with a muddy pig introduced parasites that ruined sleep quality and caused constant itching. It is hard to get a good night of rest when your bed warmer is mooing and pooping on the floor next to you. 77. Voltaire was a brilliant philosopher who wrote thousands of letters, but he was absolute trash at taking care of himself. He followed a strict rule of sleeping only 4 hours a night and spent the rest of his time drinking coffee. He reportedly chugged up to 40 cups a day to keep his brain firing at maximum speed. This chemical abuse caused him to suffer from constant nervous fits and violent twitching that terrified his friends. He was basically vibrating with caffeine while trying to act like a dignified intellectual. It is a miracle his heart did not explode. 78. The history of gynecology is full of horrors, but this surgery for insomnia is the absolute worst of them all. 19th century doctors believed that a woman's sleep problems were caused by nervous excitement from her own body. To fix this, they would surgically remove the clitoris without anesthesia to stop the so-called bad behavior. It was a barbaric mutilation designed to control women, rather than cure any actual medical condition. The trauma of the surgery caused permanent physical and psychological damage that ruined lives forever. It is a shameful reminder of how medicine was used as a weapon. 79. In the 1950s, a German company released a wonder drug called thalidomide that promised to be the safest sleep aid ever. It was specifically marketed to pregnant women to help with morning sickness and insomnia without any side effects. It became a global tragedy when thousands of babies were born with missing limbs and severe deformities. The drug interfered with fetal development in a way that scientists had never seen before. It took years to connect the dots and ban the pill, but the damage was already done to an entire generation. It was a medical disaster. 80. Soldiers in the Revolutionary War could not afford to snore because it might give away their position to the enemy. To prevent backsleeping, which causes snoring, they sewed actual cannonballs into the back of their uniform shirts. If a soldier rolled onto his back during the night, the iron ball would grind into his spine and wake him up in agony. It was a brutal form of conditioning that left men with massive bruises and chronic back pain. They stayed quiet, but they were also sleep-deprived and incredibly sore, which is not great for winning a war. 81. We all know that warm milk helps a baby sleep, but historical parents decided to spice it up with a dangerous additive. In a stroke of pure genius, they would soak tobacco leaves in the milk before heating it up for a bedtime drink. The nicotine from the tobacco would leach into the liquid, creating a potent neurotoxin that the unsuspecting sleeper would chug down. Instead of drifting off, the person would usually experience violent tremors and projectile vomiting as their body rejected the poison. It turns out that a nicotine overdose is not very relaxing, but at least you were too sick to care about being awake. 82. The beauty industry in the 1920s was absolutely glowing, and unfortunately so were the faces of the women using this product. Companies sold radium face cream that promised to rejuvenate the skin while you slept and make you look radiant in the morning. Women would slather their faces in actual radioactive material before hitting the pillow, not realizing it was destroying their DNA. The radiation would slowly eat away at their facial tissue and jawbones while they dreamed of eternal youth. It is a terrifying example of how marketing can convince people to pay good money to irradiate their own heads every single night. 83. Victorian superstitions were strong enough to ruin a good night of sleep for absolutely everyone in the house. People believed that if you looked into a mirror at night, you might see the devil or trap your soul forever. To prevent this spiritual disaster, they would cover every mirror in the bedroom with heavy black cloth before turning out the lights. This created a room full of dark, ominous shapes that looked exactly like ghosts standing in the corner. The anxiety of waking up to these draped figures was enough to keep anyone awake with their heart pounding in terror. 84. John F. Kennedy was the most powerful man in the world, but his nightly routine was a pharmacy receipt of horrors. To manage his chronic back pain and stress, he relied on a daily cocktail of strong painkillers and sleeping pills. His doctors would often inject him with amphetamines to wake up and then sedate him heavily to knock him out at night. This chemical roller coaster meant that the leader of the free world was operating in a state of managed intoxication. His famous cool demeanor was partly due to the fact that his brain was constantly fogged by a mixture of hard drugs. 85. Before modern regulations, doctors thought electricity was a magical force that could reset the human brain like a clock. If you complained of insomnia, they might attach electrodes to your temples and deliver a raw shock to your skull. The theory was that the jolt would reorganize your nervous system and force it into a rhythmic sleep cycle. In reality, the unregulated voltage often caused memory loss and confusion that erased entire days of your life. It is technically true that you cannot have insomnia if you do not remember being awake, but that is not exactly a cure. 86. In the 1960s, doctors handed out Valium prescriptions like they were candy to anyone who felt slightly stressed. It became known as Mother's Little Helper because millions of housewives used it to numb the boredom of suburban life. The drug was highly addictive, and users quickly built up a tolerance that required higher doses to sleep. We now know that long-term use of these benzodiazepines is linked to early-onset dementia and severe memory problems. An entire generation of women was essentially sedated into a fog that stole their golden years before they even got there. 87. Victorian inventors were obsessed with the idea that breathing through your mouth was a moral failing that caused stupidity. To fix this, they sold heavy bandages and straps designed to tape your mouth shut while you slept. See, this was not the gentle tape used today, but a restrictive muzzle that terrified the sleeper if they woke up gasping for air. The real danger was that if you vomited during the night, you would likely choke to death on your own dinner. It is a high price to pay just to avoid being called a mouth breather by judgmental society. 88. The Gilded Age was famous for excess, and that included a late-night snack habit that ruined thousands of stomachs. Wealthy socialites would go out after the theater and gorge themselves on rich lobster and butter sauce at midnight. This protein and fat bomb sat in the stomach like a brick and caused massive dyspepsia or severe indigestion. They called it the lobster nightmare because the physical discomfort caused vivid and terrifying dreams all night long. So it turns out that eating a sea monster right before bed is the perfect recipe for sleeping, like you are fighting one. 89. If you lived in a fashionable Victorian home, your bedroom walls were likely painted with a stunning shade of emerald green. This color was made using a pigment called Paris green, which was loaded with toxic arsenic. In damp weather, the wallpaper would flake and release invisible arsenic dust into the air directly above the bed. The sleeper would inhale this poison all night and wake up with headaches, nausea, and chronic insomnia. They were literally dying for fashion, while wondering why they felt so sick in their own beautiful sanctuary. It gives a whole new meaning to a killer paint job. 90. The most famous sleep hack in history is counting sheep, and it is also the absolute worst advice ever given. The idea is to bore yourself to sleep, but counting requires the brain to perform math and focus on a sequence. This activity actually activates the processing centers of the brain and keeps you more awake than before. It also creates anxiety because you start realizing exactly how long you have been lying there awake. You are better off visualizing a calm scene than doing mental arithmetic until the sun comes up. It is time to retire the sheep permanently. 91. The king of pop changed music forever, but his sleep routine was a medical disaster waiting to happen. Michael Jackson did not just take sleeping pills, he hired a doctor to administer surgical anesthesia every single night. He called propofol his milk because of its white color, but it is actually a powerful anesthetic designed for major surgery. The terrifying reality is that anesthesia is not sleep. It is a chemical coma that prevents your brain from entering REM cycles. He spent months without real rest until his body finally gave up on the illusion. It is a tragic lesson that you cannot buy sleep. 92. If you had a chest cold or insomnia in the 19th century, your mother might mix up a burning paste. The mustard plaster was a thick poultice made of crushed mustard seeds, flour, and water spread on a cloth. They slapped this burning hot mess directly onto your chest to warm the blood and draw out inflammation. The chemical reaction on the skin caused intense heat that often resulted in second-degree chemical burns. It is impossible to sleep when your chest feels like it is on fire and your skin is blistering. This home remedy was basically a torture device. A 93. When Ambien hit the market, it promised a full 8 hours of rest, but users soon discovered a terrifying side effect. People started waking up with crumbs in their beds or mysterious dents in their cars with no memory of what happened. It turns out the drug could induce a zombie state where users would sleep cook or even sleep drive while totally unconscious. Imagine waking up in a jail cell wearing your pajamas because you drove to the grocery store while fast asleep. The Ambien walrus became a legendary internet character, but the reality was incredibly dangerous for everyone on the road. 94. Central heating is a luxury, so our ancestors used a metal pan on a stick to survive the winter nights. They would fill a brass warming pan with red-hot coals from the fireplace and slide it between the ice-cold sheets. And the idea was to toast the mattress before getting in. But accidents were incredibly common and deadly. The latch would often fail, dumping live embers onto the flammable straw mattress while the family slept. Instead of a cozy night, they would wake up to a house fire and severe burns. It brings a terrifying new meaning to the phrase bed warmer. 95. History is full of bad food combinations, but chocolate-covered garlic might be the absolute worst idea for a bedtime snack. Some health enthusiasts believed garlic cleaned the blood while chocolate made the medicine go down easier. The problem is that garlic causes massive heartburn and indigestion, while chocolate contains caffeine and sugar. Eating this unholy mixture right before bed guaranteed that you would be wide awake with acid reflux and a racing heart. It is the culinary equivalent of punching yourself in the throat to relax. Who knew that spicy candy was bad for sleep? 96. In the 1940s, nothing said safety like spraying a cloud of neurotoxin directly onto your children's pillows. Families used DDT bug spray to kill mosquitoes and bedbugs, believing the chemical was completely harmless to humans. Advertisements showed happy mothers fogging the entire bedroom before tucking their kids in for a peaceful night. In reality, they were coating their sleeping environment with a potent poison that attacks the nervous system and causes long-term damage. It is terrifying to watch old commercials where people inhale this stuff like it is fresh air. We really did not know when to stop with the chemicals. 97. The Wild West was a dangerous place, so frontiersmen developed the habit of sleeping with a loaded gun under the pillow. This seems smart for protection, until you realize that waking up confused is a universal human experience. Sleep inertia causes a few seconds of total brain fog where you do not know who or where you are. Grabbing a hair-trigger revolver during a nightmare or a noise often resulted in shooting a toe or a spouse. It turns out that mixing lethal weapons with semi-conscious hallucinations is a recipe for a very tragic accident in the bedroom. 98. Lyndon B. Johnson was a president who demanded total control, and that included the sleep schedules of everyone around him. He installed a terrifying system of loud buzzers throughout the White House to summon his aides instantly. He would press a button at any hour of the night and expect his staff to be awake and running within seconds. This created a culture of chronic sleep deprivation where no one could ever truly relax or enter deep sleep. It was psychological warfare disguised as efficiency, and it likely made the government run much worse. He was the nightmare boss. 99. Victorian doctors were obsessed with the idea that a woman's uterus was a wandering animal that caused all her problems. If a woman had insomnia, they assumed her womb was moving around and needed to be shocked back into place. The treatment involved applying electric current directly to the pelvic region to stun the organ into submission. It was an invasive and painful procedure based on absolutely zero science that caused immense physical trauma. Or imagine trying to sleep after a doctor has just electrocuted your insides because he does not understand biology. It is a shameful chapter in medical history. 100. Modern medicine gave us a device called the Actic lozenge, which is basically a lollipop laced with potent fentanyl. It was designed for breakthrough cancer pain, but some doctors prescribed it off-label for severe sleep issues. The danger is that fentanyl is an incredibly strong opioid that can stop your breathing in minutes. Patients would put the lollipop in their mouth to doze off and accidentally overdose as the drug dissolved while they slept. It is the deadliest candy ever made, and using it as a sleep aid is like using a hand grenade to turn off the lights. 101. The 1950s promised you could learn Mandarin while you snored, but it was a total scam. These clunky headsets played audio tapes all night long directly into your ears while you tried to rest. The theory was that the subconscious mind never sleeps, so it can absorb facts without effort. In reality, the constant noise prevented the brain from entering deep restorative sleep stages, which are crucial for actual memory formation. People woke up exhausted and irritable with zero new language skills to show for their suffering. It turns out that listening to a monotone voice for 8 hours is just annoying, not educational. 102. If you thought drinking was the only way to consume alcohol, you clearly do not know history. High societies sometimes used alcohol enemas to bypass the liver and get drunk instantaneously without the breath smell. This was occasionally used to induce a stupor for sleep, but it was incredibly dangerous because the alcohol hit the bloodstream all at once. There was no way to vomit it back up if you had too much, which led to fatal alcohol poisoning. It is the most efficient way to destroy your body while trying to relax, and it frequently ended in a very embarrassing autopsy. 103. Safety standards in the mid-20th century were basically non-existent, and nothing proves that like the asbestos blanket. These heavy covers were sold as fireproof safety gear that would protect you and your family while you slept. The marketing forgot to mention that the blanket was shedding microscopic carcinogenic fibers directly into your lungs with every breath. You were literally wrapping yourself in a cancer, causing cocoon every single night to stay warm. It is tragic that the thing designed to save you from a fire was actually killing you slowly from the inside out. 104. Before central heating and smoke detectors, keeping the house from burning down was a full-time job. One family member had to stay awake during the night on a shift called the watch to guard the open fire. This meant that someone was always chronically sleep-deprived and staring at the embers in a state of high anxiety. If you fell asleep, the entire family could die, so the pressure was immense and exhausting. Now it explains why our ancestors were so serious, because one nap could literally end the bloodline in a pile of ash. 105. Salvador Dali was a surrealist genius who believed that actual sleep was the enemy of creativity. He developed a micro-nap technique where he sat in a chair holding a heavy metal key over a plate. The moment he drifted off, his muscles relaxed, and the key crashed down, waking him up instantly. He claimed this harvest of the space between waking and sleeping gave him his bizarre ideas. It allowed him to access hallucinations without drugs, but it also meant he never got any real rest. He was basically edging his own brain for art. 106. We usually think of a douche as a hygiene product, but in the 19th century it was a weapon. Doctors used a high-pressure hose to blast freezing cold water directly at the spine of insomnia patients. This hydrotherapy was supposed to shock the nervous system into submission and force the body to relax. The sheer force of the water jet was painful enough to leave bruises, and the cold caused uncontrollable shivering. It is hard to imagine how being waterboarded from behind was considered a relaxing treatment for someone who just wanted to sleep. 107. Modern rap culture popularized a drink called lean, but its roots are in dangerous medical misuse. It is a mixture of prescription strength cough syrup containing codeine and promethazine mixed with soda and candy. The combination slows down the brain and respiratory system to a crawl, which users mistake for relaxation. In reality, it causes seizures and can easily stop a person from breathing if they fall asleep too deeply. It is a chemical lobotomy in a styrofoam cup that has claimed the lives of many talented artists who just wanted to slow down. 108. We now know that blue light from screens ruins sleep, but early scientists got it completely backward. Some researchers experimented with blue-tinted lenses or lights to treat depression and fatigue during the day. They inadvertently discovered that this light spectrum suppresses melatonin, the hormone that tells you to sleep. By exposing patients to this light, they were actually keeping them awake and ruining their circadian rhythms even more. It is ironic that the very thing they thought would cure the blues was actually keeping everyone wide awake and miserable all night long. 109. Folk remedies are often harmless, but this one involves eating industrial solvent on a sugar cube. Rural families used to pour turpentine, which is paint thinner, over a spoonful of sugar to cure internal ailments. They believed it would kill parasites and help children sleep by cleaning them out from the inside. Turpentine is toxic to the kidneys and nervous system and can cause chemical burns in the throat. It is terrifying that parents were feeding their kids the same stuff used to strip varnish off furniture just to get some peace and quiet. 110. If you think a stuffy room is bad, just wait until you hear about carbon dioxide therapy. Experimental doctors placed patients in sealed chambers and slowly increased the levels of carbon dioxide to induce unconsciousness. The theory was that the brain would naturally shut down in the presence of the gas, which is technically true because it is suffocating. This was not sleep. It was controlled asphyxiation that killed brain cells by the millions. Waking up from this treatment left patients with a pounding headache and significant cognitive damage. It was a gas chamber sold as a cure. 111. Before alarm clocks were cheap and reliable, the industrial world relied on a human version called the knocker-upper. These men were hired to walk the streets at dawn and shoot dried peas at bedroom windows with a long pipe. Their entire job was to ensure that no one ever got to sleep in or enjoy a lazy morning. They would not leave until you showed your face at the window, proving you were awake and miserable. So it is the most annoying wake-up call in history, and you had to pay them to do it. If you are still awake after hearing about tobacco enemas and radioactive pillows, congratulations. You are officially smarter than your ancestors. But I have to ask, which of these absolute nightmares would you actually try for a good night's sleep? The heroin syrup or the cage outside the window? Tell me in the comments below. Smash that like button and subscribe to Dumb History right now, because the past is stupid and I am here to prove it. Click the video on your screen for more insanity and sweet dreams.